Herman Melville's 1851 prose poem epic, The Whale, or Moby Dick, is recognised as one of the greatest works of literature ever written in English. It's certainly one of my personal favourite novels of all time, and Herman Melville sits in fine company in my personal canon alongside Cervantes, Proust, George Eliot, Tolstoy, and William Shakespeare. Melville is also in tremendous company with the great writers of the American tradition, a tradition that houses the likes of Walt Whitman, William Faulkner, Hart Crane, Emily Dickinson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Wallace Stevens, Mark Twain, Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was quite a cherished friend of Herman Melville's, Ernest Hemingway, Cormac McCarthy, Toni Morrison, Thomas Pynchon, Don DeLillo, John Steinbeck, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Harper Lee, and Robert Frost. Certainly one only needs to look at that rundown of great writers to know that the American tradition is one of the most exciting and fertile literary traditions in the entire world. It's a tragedy that Herman Melville was underappreciated in his own time. He was not timely as a writer, and Moby Dick would go on to be posthumously revered, in part thanks to a revival of Melville studies in the first half of the 20th century, which resulted in a deep fascination with Melville's language and his magnum opus, Moby Dick, a fascination that has only picked up more and more steam with every passing year. Today, one says Moby Dick, and one is immediately confronted with the image of the Leviathan that has entered the common imagination. One thinks of the monomaniacal, peg-legged Captain Ahab. One thinks of the tattooed cannibal Queequeg. Indeed, one thinks of many of the crew members of the Pequod. And of course, one most certainly thinks of our enigmatic narrator, the one who implores us to call him Ishmael. Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse, and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially whenever my hypos get such an upper hand of me that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off, then I account it high time to get to sea as soon as I can. Students may fear the novel, they may fear being assigned Moby Dick to read, and even the most intrepid, fearless deep reader of great literature may find themselves abandoning the work halfway through, whilst others will become so enamoured with the work that they find themselves attending 24-hour read-alongs, and falling ever deeper in love with Moby Dick, they discover that one reading most certainly is not enough. They discover that one must go on reading and rereading Moby Dick throughout the course of one's life. And so today, because Moby Dick is a very special book for me, it holds a lot of deep and personal meaning, and I strongly believe that you could fall in love with the book too. I strongly believe that it will become one of those special works that you cherish continuously over the course of your life. I have a feeling that you will draw comfort, companionship, kinship from this great work. Spiritual nourishment can be drawn too, because ultimately Moby Dick, at least to me, is a thoroughly spiritual novel. It's about the hunt for meaning and the quest after more life. And to kick off our deep communal reading of this masterpiece of the Hardcore Literature Book Club, today I would like to offer you 10 tips for how to get as much out of Moby Dick as possible. Let's run through everything from mindset, challenges, recommended editions, and much more. Let's get into the video. Okay, the very first tip that I would like you to embrace is, before you embark on your deep reading of Moby Dick, begin to ponder over, muse upon, mull over what your quest is. That's my question to you. What is your quest? What voyage are you on? Yes, Moby Dick ostensibly is about a whaling voyage. It's about revenge. It's about the hunt after the white whale. But part of the reason Moby Dick is such a masterpiece is because it is freighted with symbolism. It is weighted with allusion and allegory. And we must read Moby Dick in the way we read our own unconscious, how we interpret our dreams, our unconscious desires, wishes, wants, and fears. We're reading Moby Dick, but what we're actually doing is we're thinking about our own journey, our own quest. And yes, we're all on our own quest. We're all hunting after something. And if you read Moby Dick correctly, the book will be a companion. It will aid you and provide nourishment, moral, spiritual, emotional, intellectual, whilst you are embarking upon your own journey, because we are all on our own journey. So think about where you are today, where you've come from, where you're headed, what your spiritual hunt is. Think about who you are. What stage of life are you in? And when you begin a journey, you need to solicit some tools to help you. We see that very early on in the novel, Ishmael, discontented with living on shore, he needs to sail about and see the watery part of the world for a little bit. Otherwise, he's going to grow too depressed. He's going to lose his mind. He needs to get away from society. He needs to go on a journey. And what we see is what Joseph Campbell would call the hero's journey. And the very first thing he does is he slings his things into a carpet bag, throws that carpet bag over his shoulder, and walks through the streets in search of a Nantucket whaling vessel. So perhaps you begin your journey by thinking about what you would put in your carpet bag. What do you need to help you on your journey? And remember, of course, that one cannot talk about Moby Dick without deploying figurative language, without embracing metaphor and allegory. And this is part of the reason why Moby Dick is so endlessly rereadable. Perhaps the first hero's journey that immediately leaps to mind is from the book of Jonah, which Herman Melville wants us to think about before we've even turned to chapter 1, Loomings. If you go to the extracts that preface the story, you'll see that his third extract, his third quotation, comes after Genesis and Job. It begins with Genesis, which takes us right back to the beginning of creation, and God created great whales. And then we see Job. Leviathan maketh a path to shine after him. One would think the deep to be hoary. Then we get to Jonah. Now the Lord had prepared a great fish to swallow up Jonah. It's from the biblical story of Jonah and the whale that Joseph Campbell gets this idea of being in the belly of the whale. When we talk about going on a journey, we don't necessarily need to move our physical location, though indeed that might be part of it. What we're actually talking about is a metaphysical journey, a journey of the soul, the mind, the heart, and it requires us to go deep into the depths, to go underwater, to go into the belly of the whale and to escape. And sometimes the hero escapes, sometimes the hero drowns and is reborn. You see in all the great mythologies, all the great religions, this death and rebirth motif is extensively applied. And that's because it speaks to an inner part of us, a part of our unconscious, what Jung would call the collective unconscious. So perhaps we need to die and be reborn. And of course, what we're talking about is an ego death. What we're talking about when we say we're going underwater or we're going to the underworld and the netherworld, we're going to hell and back. What we're doing is we're going to those deep, dark parts of ourselves. Again, I deploy language from Carl Jung, one of the great psychologists. We're going to our own shadow realm. We're doing shadow work. We're doing deep self-work. And what we're trying to do is integrate those parts of our unconscious and make them conscious, become aware of our dark side, solicit our dark side to be our friend. So when we talk about dying and being reborn, we might mean that we need to lose a part of ourselves. We might mean that we've picked up something extraneous that doesn't help us and we need to get rid of it. This could be actual people in our lives. It could be a way of living. It could be a job. It could be a thought process. Whatever it is, whatever you're dealing with, perhaps you need to shed it, and you might not even fully, at least not consciously, know what it is yet. But that's why we go on a journey, to uncover what we need to be aware of. Now, some heroes' journeys, the hero doesn't die, they re-emerge. And if they re-emerge, they usually do so after a battle triumphantly won. Joseph Campbell, in addition to talking about Jonah and the whale, Jonah being swallowed up by the whale for 3 days and 3 nights because he defied God. God sent a storm to rock his ship, so they threw Jonah overboard. He was swallowed up by a whale, and then afterwards he realized that he needs to do the job that God sent him to do. In addition to the biblical story of Jonah, Joseph Campbell talks about Siegfried and his battle with the dragon, and when he slays the dragon, he drinks the dragon's blood. And what does that symbolize? That symbolizes integrating a part of our dark unconscious and bringing it to awareness so as to make us stronger and more robust and more healthy individuals. When one reads through Moby Dick, one is impressed at the onslaught of biblical allusions. The book itself, the central preoccupation, is a biblical allusion. Think about the symbolism of going to sea. Water features significantly in every primary religious ritual. It's cleansing, but again, harping on that Jungian idea, water also symbolizes our unconscious. It's like returning to a primal state, a different level of consciousness that isn't front brain, hyperactivity, overthinking. That's not what we want to return to. And why do we go on journeys? Well, because the realm we're in right now, and again, I draw in language from Joseph Campbell because his Heroes with 1,000 Faces is the textbook for heroes' journeys. It's a wonderful read, and I highly recommend you check it out if you haven't already. Campbell talks about moving away from the realm of light that we know and are comfortable with, and going into the darkness. We move away from this realm and we go to a threshold, and at that threshold there be monsters, there be sea beasts and leviathans, and their duty is to destroy us and our duty is to survive. And hopefully after we've been on our quest and we've battled these monsters and we've found ourselves submerged and floundering, hopefully we re-emerge triumphant and stronger than we were before. And these journeys, these voyages, these whaling voyages of the soul that are distinct and individual to us, but also something that we can all relate to. So we are all going on our own specific journey, but we're kind of all together, and we can give each other companionship and kinship and comfort. The reason we go on these journeys, despite the hardship and the challenges, despite the pain, and of course when we talk about pain, I cannot help but pull up Nietzsche and Edmund Burke, who seem to be in agreement with one another that pain, or the highest degree of pain, is more affecting than the highest degree of pleasure. How does one impress a memory upon the man-animal? It's pain. Pain is intricately tied to meaning, memory, and morality. So pain holds meaning. So pivot into the pain. Whenever you find yourself distressed or depressed, go deeper, because you will re-emerge triumphant. We go on these difficult journeys, we go into the depths of our unconscious, and we talk to our shadow self, and maybe we have to battle our shadow self a little bit, and we try to make it conscious, because, in the words of Carl Jung, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Over the course of the Moby Dick lecture series, we will be looking at the 4 stages of competence. We'll also be talking about Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. If you find yourself wondering, hang on a minute, what is my quest? What is my voyage? Because to some people it might be more self-evident than to others. To some it might be tied in with their vocation. To others it might be tied into their relationship, their family, their community. If you find yourself struggling to find what your journey, what your quest might be, you may wish to consult Erikson's stages of psychosocial development and ask yourself, what stage of life are you in right now? Firstly, how old are you? If you look at Erikson's psychosocial crisis and the virtues one must develop in each period, one also gets to see the significant relationship in their life, and they are met with an existential question. So one looks to the early adult stage, for instance, that's from age 20 to 44 years of age, and we're told by Erikson that the dominant virtue is love. The psychosocial crisis is intimacy. versus isolation. And perhaps one significant relationship in this time of one's life is their friends and their partners. And the existential question that might plague one at this time and might preface a journey is, can I love? Indeed, if you find yourself in middle adulthood, 45 to 64 years of age, perhaps the virtue you should concern yourself with is this virtue of care. And the existential question you may find yourself asking is, can I make my life count? This is where you might find yourself working on a legacy project, perhaps a book that will transcend you and be there after you are gone. That's just one example. Perhaps one finds themselves in late adulthood, that's age 65 and above, and the virtue one should concern themselves with, according to Erickson, is wisdom. The significant relationship in one's life at the age of 65 and above is all of humankind, all of humanity. And the existential question one might pose to themselves during those dark nights of the soul is it okay to have been me as you reflect upon the course of your life? These are just some ideas we're kicking out there. And keep in mind that our journeys are circuitous, they are circular, they are recurring. Where we begin is where we end up, but hopefully we end up at that beginning with new insights that make us a better, more evolved, more consciously aware individual. And so what we'll be doing as we move through Moby Dick in the book club is we'll be getting more comfortable and learning how to read symbolism. Because yes, it's about whales, it's about hunting after a whale. And why was whaling such an important industry in the 19th century? Well, it wasn't just the 19th century, though the 19th century was the heyday of American whaling. We've been whaling for thousands and thousands of years. It's only recently that we've really plugged into the cruelty of that. It's not something that a reader of Moby Dick in Melville's time would have spent much of their time contemplating, though there are some very touching, poignant and tragic chapters that do show that Melville himself meditated upon the cruelty of their actions. But back then, whaling was everything. If you didn't whale, then you didn't have light for your candles. So the whale literally symbolizes light. If you didn't whale or go on whaling voyages, you didn't eat. There were so many products of day-to-day life that one needed to hunt whales for back in the day. Now, of course, we look through a more modern and environmental lens and our hearts break. I'm personally somebody who cannot read about cruelty to animals. It's part of the reason why I abandoned Ernest Hemingway's Death in the Afternoon. I was living in Valencia and I tried to read that book and I could not stomach it. It's about bullfighting. And there are very many heartbreaking passages in Moby Dick too. And indeed, as I read through Moby Dick, I really do try to keep the symbolic reading in my mind first and foremost. Yes, whaling as an industry, we're going to talk about that in the lecture series in the book club. We're going to talk about how every part of the whale was used and nothing went to waste. We'll talk about that, but first and foremost, it's a symbolic book and it's a visionary novel. And Melville's purpose is to help you explicate the inner facts, the psychic facts of your own life. And so sometimes when I read Moby Dick, I find myself wondering who I align with the most. And this is an interesting question to ponder over with each reread of this great book. Are you Captain Ahab? I would profess that many are. Are you Ishmael? I would profess that many are. You might find yourself to be more in simpatico with Queequeg. And indeed, you may find, as I do from time to time, that you have a lot of commonalities with the whale itself. Next up, let's talk about recommended editions. Now, this is really important, and whilst I won't be overtly prescriptive with what edition you should choose, what I will say is you absolutely must choose an edition that has the etymology and the extracts prefacing the story. Melville put those extracts, excavated with the seemingly sacred and profane back to back. He didn't put them there frivolously, he put them there for a reason, and some editions don't include them. I really like the Wordsworth Classics edition. It's great for marginalia, it's cheaply available and freely available, and it comes with the extracts. It comes with the etymology on the first page. If you go for the Everyman edition at any part of the publishing house's evolution, I like these covers though, you will get the extracts. if you find one of the old Penguin popular classics, which I believe are out of print now, but you can get the black covered classics, then you'll see that the extracts and etymology kicks off the story, and this is really, really important. And in the book club, we're going to be excavating the extracts and returning to them frequently. The thing about voyages, quests, and journeys is very often the journey we take is just an excuse for the meaning that comes to us along the way. So journeys are circuitous and meaning is in the margins. That means we preoccupy ourselves with becoming experts on whaling, experts on cetology, that's the study of whales. But whilst we're doing that, what we're actually doing is becoming experts on ourselves, our own inner light. Our intrapersonal communication is sharpened, that's our communication with ourselves, and we are obtaining a deeper relationship with whatever spirituality we discern. That's not for me to designate. I do believe everybody, regardless of profession, has something that they hold sacred and dear, something that contains meaning. And so we're learning all about whaling, but what we're actually doing is learning about ourselves. Now, Melville was incredibly well read, as well as absorbing these nautical journals. He was also deep reading Shakespeare, Milton, Byron, Robert Burton, and you can see all of that in his work, in his grand masterpiece. Indeed, Captain Ahab seems to have been stitched together with parts of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Milton's Satan, and a plethora of dark, tragic protagonists from Shakespeare's great plays. I'm thinking Iago, I'm thinking a little bit of Hamlet and Macbeth, and of course King Lear. If one goes to the etymology that kicks off the book, we're told that whale and where it comes from, its Danish and Swedish etymological root, tells us that the animal is named from roundness or rolling. It's arched or vaulted. It comes from the word meaning to roll, to wallow. And once you have that word in your mind, you will not fail to see it in the text. Herman Melville in Moby Dick is obsessed with this idea of rolling. And that leads us back to this idea that journeys are circuitous, they're circular, and they always take us back to where we started. Now, my next tip is to take the opportunity afforded to you with your deep reading of Moby Dick to explore scriptural wisdom literature, explore the Bible. One only needs to rifle through the opening chapters of Moby Dick to see that Moby Dick is pregnant with biblical allusions, so it's a nice opportunity to expand your field of consciousness, to learn more about the Western mythology, the paradigms through which we see the world unconsciously. And these Bible stories are actually really resonant, and they have a lot of meaning, and they are great literature in and of themselves, particularly if you plump for Herman Melville's own favoured version of the Bible, the King James Version. I would highly recommend you pick up whatever Bible you're comfortable with. But as you go through, and this is something we're going to be doing in the lecture series at the book club, we're going to be taking some off-roads and we're going to go down biblical rabbit holes. We're going to have dedicated lectures on Jonah and the whale, on Job, on Genesis. Indeed, go through the first few pages and you'll see allusions to many more. Acts, Jude, New Testament wisdom from the likes of Luke, for example. So it's a great opportunity to learn more about the Bible, which is what we're going to be doing. That's what I would recommend, is to follow those off-roads. Learn about the Bible, learn about the high romantics, learn about Shakespeare. So use Moby Dick to unlock biblical wisdom literature, because ultimately this is a spiritual journey. Now, this doesn't mean that one needs to subscribe to the Christian faith. I personally don't, though of course I was raised Roman Catholic. I'm much more secular in my belief, and I don't find my own belief conceptualized well enough in any doctrine, but I do find myself personally interested in all of the doctrines. If you look to that first chapter, loomings, and of course what does loomings mean? Loomings means a shadowy apparition, perhaps on the horizon, coming nearer like a leviathan. Indeed, one looks at the onslaught of extracts that preface Moby Dick, and one thinks that Melville was surely trying to create the effect of the Leviathan, physically and metaphysically, as a shadowy apparition on the horizon before we've even come to the story. So the reputation of the white whale certainly precedes it. We're already in awe of the idea of the whale. That first chapter, Loomings, call me Ishmael, we start to wonder, who is talking? Is his name really Ishmael? Why are we calling him Ishmael? Where are we? When is this taking place? Those deep readers of the Bible among us will know that Ishmael was the first son of Abraham through Hagar, the Egyptian handmaiden slave of Sarah. And Ishmael is the common patriarch of the Abrahamic religions venerated by Muslims and Christians alike. Ishmael died at the age of 137 after founding a great nation and was buried in Mecca alongside his mother. Ishmael is what we call a theophoric name. Ishmael, theophoric. That means that God is embedded in the name itself. And indeed it is, because embedded in that name we see God. God has hearkened. That's what Ishmael means. And we can find Ishmael in Genesis, books 16 through to 25. Next up, let's talk about pacing, because Moby Dick is a very big book and it can take one a while to get through. And that's a good thing. But it's not unachievable to get through Moby Dick. I've shared in many different videos and audios an anecdote from my first year tutor at the University of Oxford, who really wanted us to read Moby Dick because it is filled with resplendent and luxurious prose. It is one of those endlessly affecting works, and he wanted us to have the experience of Moby Dick and going on the voyage with the Pequod. And he said, read a chapter a day, because how does one eat the white whale? Well, a bite at a time, a chapter a day. And indeed, if you look at the chapters of Moby Dick, they're very, very short. Some of them are extremely short. Very often they're only a page or 2 pages. There are a couple of chapters that are a little bit longer, but generally they're very, very short, which makes it very doable if you follow a chapter a day approach. Now, many of the big books on the Hardcore Literature Book Club schedule, though the lectures come out over the course of a few months, many of them would really be well served by a much slower and deeper reading. Les Miserables, for example, has 365 chapters, and it's perfect for the chapter a day approach and getting through it in a year. Anna Karenina is quite similar. Don Quixote is quite similar. Proust most certainly benefits from a very long, deep, slow reading with rereading baked in. So I think the chapter a day approach is perfect for Moby Dick. If you're an ambitious reader, if you're a quick reader, you might want to go for 2 to 3 chapters per day. That's still really doable. Alternatively, just take it at your leisure. You might want to read a chapter and then reread it, journal around it, use Moby Dick to complement the other great works of literature that you're reading. Perhaps you're reading poetry as well, perhaps you're reading Shakespeare, perhaps you enjoy falling down a rabbit hole. So part of your Moby Dick reading actually involves going to Shakespeare and the Bible and the High Romantics. But that's a good pacing. I would say with this one, certainly don't be in a rush. Now, of course, we all have different paces. Some of us voraciously eat up literature. If you're a fast reader, I would highly recommend that you reread it again very soon afterwards, and then commit to coming back to it frequently or consistently over the course of your life. There is no rush with these big books. The reason that we put so much thought into the selection process, the curation, is because we want to get it right from the outset. We want to pick those books that we will fall deeply in love with. We want to pick those life-changing books, and we want to get as intimate a knowledge of them as possible. So because we've picked the right books, and Moby Dick most certainly is what we would call the right book, we can slow down, we can take our time, we can enjoy the ride, and that's the best way to read Moby Dick. So that leads me on to my next tip and some related tips that I think will really help your reading of The Whale, and that is to reread and to journal and to also keep a commonplace book. Let's go through those. So there's many different ways to reread. When I say reread, very often people envision reading from A to Z all the way through, start to finish, over again. And that is one way to reread. That's the way I reread after a few years away from the text. Now, the way I consistently read works by writers, when I say I'm always reading Shakespeare, I'm always reading Proust, that's very often talking about a style of reading that involves going to key passages that I have already pre-selected and then reading around that passage. Now, sometimes there's a little bit of A to Z reading front to back, but very often it's tied in with my marginalia, those passages that I have already selected as holding meaning to me. And as you go through the work, it would be a really good idea to mark your page, if you don't mind doing that, with those passages that you want to reflect upon. Now, it might be that you really love the language. Moby Dick is filled with luxurious language. It's an absolute fireworks display. It's so amazing on that level alone, which leads me to a subsidiary tip, which is relish the language aloud. Feel it on your lips and in your mouth. Speak the words into existence. Share it with other people. Now, if you're feeling shy, I would urge you to sub-vocalize. Move your lips. Feel your tongue moving. Indeed, you may wish to listen to somebody else read these passages. That's a really good thing. That's why read-alongs are such a great idea, and that's why read-alongs are so popular. That's why we have so many great audiobooks or audio projects with celebrities lending their vocal cords to the whale. So read aloud and reread. Now, you might want your rereading to be tied into your journaling practice. I don't journal every day anymore because I simply don't have the time. What I like to do is put aside an hour. It's usually not an hour, it's about 30 minutes usually, but on a Sunday when I don't have as many obligations, and I carve out a little bit of stillness, a little bit of time, a little bit of quiet just for myself. And I sit down with a pot of strong black coffee and my journal before me and my book open. And I do this with Shakespeare, I do this with Proust, and I do this with Moby Dick. And I return to those passages that I have already underlined or circled or scribbled in the margins of, and I journal upon the themes. There's a really great passage where Melville meditates upon whiteness, the symbolism of whiteness. Now that's your journaling sorted for a whole year as far as I'm concerned, and there's many passages that are like that. So you can do the front to back rereading approach. That's great for those books that have really resonated with you and you want to relive again. It's great for those books that you want to return to consistently over the course of your life. That's your personal canon. These are the books you're always reading. They're always on your shelf or your desk or your bedside. They're always well thumbed. Maybe you have multiple copies, editions, translations, and so forth. You can tie your rereading in with your journaling and make it a weekly habit. You could do it more or less. Tailor it to suit your own life. That's the really key thing here. That's the important thing. Or you could have your rereading baked in. That's what we're doing with Proust. It's a great way to read Middlemarch. It really works quite well for those books where you can follow the original serialized publication schedule. That's what we're doing with Middlemarch, George Eliot's Middlemarch. Many like to do that with Dickens because these books came out in serial fashion across a year. So with Middlemarch, for example, and we're going a little bit off-road, but not too far off-road, a great way to reread Middlemarch with the baked-in approach is to read that first book in accordance with when it first came out, and when you go to the second book, which will be 2 months later because the books weren't published back to back, you reread that first book again, you journal about it, you reread everything you've said, and then you go on to the second book. And then when you get to the third book, maybe you do that again. Now, it sounds like a lot of work, and it is, but to me, reading is work. And I take work, I define work in the way that Khalil Gibran defines work, and he defines work as love made visible. So yes, it's work, but it's also love, and it's self-love. And so this is a great way to carve out a self-care and a self-love routine for yourself, using books as the excuse, as the scaffold, as the map. Now, I also mentioned in passing keeping a commonplace book, which is not something that I've spoken about at length to date, but this is something that we're going to be talking about in depth in the book club, because a commonplace book is quite a special little book that you can potentially carry around with you. Mine fits in my pocket. The commonplace book is different from journaling because it's, again, to use a George Eliot phrase, it's something of a quarry. When you go through a book, those lines that really speak to you, that you want to keep, maybe commit to memory, maybe come back to in isolation, you put those quotes into your little book, you commit them to the page, and you collect them together. And Moby Dick is perfect for collecting lots of great quotes together in a book. And by the time you get to the end of Moby Dick, you might have your commonplace book filled up with quotations, and it's up to you what you want to do with that. There are many different opportunities, there are many different ideas of how you might want to make use of that. Again, we'll talk about this more in depth at a later date, but keep a commonplace book if you like that idea, do some marginalia, journal and reread. Moby Dick is perfect for all of these practices. My next tip is to pair Melville's Moby Dick with Shakespeare. Again, in the Hardcore Literature Book Club, we are deep reading Shakespeare's masterpieces over the course of the year. It's the year of Shakespeare. At time of recording, we have deep read King Lear, and there's more discussion always on the way. We have read Hamlet, we have Macbeth around the corner, we have Othello. Hold the language of Melville up against Shakespeare. Now, I said that reading Moby Dick is a great opportunity to learn more about the Bible. It's also a brilliant opportunity to get into Shakespeare. As Ray Bradbury said, something to the effect of, Moby Dick is Shakespeare writing through Melville with a Ouija board. Ray Bradbury, who fell in love with the work and penned the script for the John Huston film with Gregory Peck. Wonderful filmic adaptation. And he's absolutely right. I can think of no other novelist who more thoroughly earns the title of Shakespearean novelist than Melville. He is riven through with Shakespeare. So read Shakespeare's high tragedies. Read his banquets of blood, the Elizabethan and Jacobean revenge tragedies, especially when you come to those parts with Captain Ahab. Read him up against Iago. Read him up against Hamlet and Macbeth. And this is a way to really deeply appreciate both writers all the more. You'll come away with a deeper and well-earned appreciation of the Bard and Melville. Shakespeare, it's very, very rare that we can read him up against another writer, but Melville is one of his, if not his greatest, disciples, and his work is an absolute joy. I sometimes like to ponder over what William Shakespeare himself would have made of the work. I think he would have been a fan. And whilst you're using Moby Dick to obtain a greater appreciation of Shakespeare, the Bible, the High Romantics, you may also wish to use Moby Dick to break into the American tradition. I see Melville as being one of the four horsemen of American literature, great American literature. We have Melville, who is what I might call a proet, because he writes prose and poetry and poetic prose. Moby Dick, is it a novel or is it a prose poem epic? I think the latter. He sits in great company with Ralph Waldo Emerson, whose essays we have already deep read a little bit, and we're going to gain an even deeper appreciation of his works over the course of Moby Dick. He sits in fine company with Emily Dickinson. Again, we have a couple of shows and lectures on Emily Dickinson. We're going to learn even more about her, and perhaps one would throw the eminently influential William Faulkner in there as well. We talk of writers being Faulknerian. Well, William Faulkner himself was very much influenced by Moby Dick, and his peer, Ernest Hemingway, another writer that we've spoken about, who's spoken about his short stories, and we'll learn a little bit more of him. Hemingway, who, like Tolstoy, saw himself as being quite a bit better than almost every writer. He saw Melville as being a strong contender and one that he hadn't quite beaten. Both writers found themselves to be quite envious of Moby Dick, having wished that they had written it, and we'll see why. We're going to use our deep reading of Moby Dick to learn more about the American sublime. We're going to penetrate Wallace Stevens' The Auroras of Autumn. We're going to learn a little bit about Hart Crane, a deeply elusive, dense, difficult poet who is thoroughly, at least I see him as being thoroughly Melvillian. Hart Crane, who in To Brooklyn Bridge writes, "O sleepless as the river under thee, vaulting the sea, the prairie's dreaming sod, unto us lowliest sometimes sweep, descend, and of the curved ship lend a myth to God." And my final tip for the time being, and the tip that I want to leave you with today, is to ensure that you really make a meal out of Moby Dick and deep read this masterpiece with a group. Read the insights and appreciations, the meditations on this work from other lovers of literature, and respond with your own appreciations. This is a great way to obtain an intimate knowledge of a work much more quickly than one can do by themselves. Now, the great thing about reading is it's quite a solitary activity. There's a lot of introspection. It's a nice time to be alone and to contemplate, and it suits introverts like myself, but the true joy of reading, I've discovered, is how communal it can be. When we read a great book, we're communicating with the author across time. we're communicating with ourselves, we're communicating with whatever higher power we see. And if we have a group, a tribe, a community, a family of like-minded lovers of literature around us, then we are communicating with them too. One's understanding and appreciation of a work is increased 100 times over by virtue of reading what other nuanced, empathetic thinkers are saying about that work. And we see the work from all of these different angles, which I find to be incredibly rewarding. Moby Dick is one of those works where we are reading the same book, but we're not. It means something different to everybody who picks it up. Everybody who falls in love with it, indeed anybody who resists it, reads a different book. And I find that fascinating, because one's reading of Moby Dick is truly revealing and reflective of who you are at this specific time in your life. And it's such a wonderful feeling to be surrounded by people who are all getting something out of the book, and we get all the more out of it by virtue of the group that we surround ourselves with. And so, being a member of the Hardcore Literature Book Club, contributing to discussion, or indeed reading through what people say in response to a book, it's like this nice middle ground between solitary reading and introspection and communal reading. It exists in this in-between space, which I find to be rather special. So read Moby Dick with a friend, read it aloud from time to time, journal upon it, read it with the Hardcore Literature Book Club, contribute to discussion, and ultimately keep in mind that reading Moby Dick, deep reading, Herman Melville's The Whale, is all about your quest. We can read Moby Dick through so many different lenses. Yes, there's an environmental lens. Yes, we can linger over the depictions of male-male relationships and bonding. In fact, some of the most touching depictions of male-male love exist in Moby Dick. We can read it in the tradition of the American sublime. We can appreciate the Shakespearean language and the biblical allusions, but ultimately our deep reading of Moby Dick is our own pursuit of meaning. Yes, by the end of the deep reading lecture series at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, one will be a bit of an expert on whaling, cetology, 19th century American literature, poetry, romantic poetry and the sublime, Shakespeare and the Bible. But ultimately, you will be an expert about yourself and human nature. And indeed, along the way, you may find a renewed sense of meaning. So let us know your experience of Moby Dick to date. Have you read this masterpiece before? If so, what was your experience? Did you make it all the way through? Did you need to abandon it? Did you relish it? Did you enjoy it? Did you detest it? Did you find the work inspirational? Of course, if this is your first reading, then do let us know what your expectations are going into the work. Of course, you know it's about the Leviathan, the hunt after the white whale. But what else are you expecting? And what would you like to get from this book? And of course, if you're feeling particularly fearless, then do let us know what your quest is. What quest do you find yourself on today? Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for reading along. I wish you all the very best of luck for your deep reading of Moby Dick. For those following along with the Hardcore Literature Book Club lecture series, I will be there with you every step of the way. It's going to be a tremendous experience. I'm so excited for this book. It's one of my personal favourite books of all time. I'm so excited to share it with you. Thank you again, and happy reading, everybody. Bye-bye for now.